right, what's going on, man?
Though it may seem strange, young Cam Perron seems most at home when he's hanging around with a bunch of old black men from a bygone baseball league at a ballpark in the Deep South. The old-timers have gathered for an annual reunion of the Negro Leagues, which were at one time the only home for black baseball players shut out of the majors. And every year, it's the event that Cam prizes above all else.
I've never missed one.
You haven't missed any of them?
Nope.
What number was this?
This was the 8th reunion and the 10th event that we've had in Birmingham.
And you've made them all?
Yes. I think I probably would have quit my job if they told me I couldn't go.
We first met Cam 4 years ago at Rickwood Field, the oldest ballpark in America, a fitting backdrop to celebrate several players of yesteryear. Back then, Cam was still just a teenager.
Cam!
By then, Cam had already become one of this country's foremost authorities on baseball's old Negro Leaguers, and one of their closest friends as well. This unlikeliest of tales began 1,000 miles north and 10 years ago, when Cam was just a normal boy in suburban Boston, collecting any and everything related to baseball.
Cards, photos, letters, anything.
Signed baseball cards?
Yep.
And you have how many of these?
Baseballs?
Yeah.
450, 500.
But his interests and his future were dramatically altered when at the age of 12 he came upon a set of cards featuring players from leagues in which only the ball was white.
I was fascinated by the fact that it was, different. These people were not like the mainstream baseball players, and I kind of fell for this whole underdog aspect.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, greetings and salutations, friends. How are you doing? And thanks for coming by. My name is Tim Hanlon, as you hopefully know by now, and this is Good Seats Still Available. Yes, the curious little podcast that is devoted to, say it with me now, what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for finding us, downloading us, putting us in your earbuds. We appreciate it. And hopefully we will delight you as we try to do each and every week, but maybe a little extra especially, yeah, something like that this week with a conversation that we've been just dying to get out there to you, but we've had to sit on it for a little while because it's time to the release of a book. We try to do our best to be promotionally helpful for some of our guests, especially those that fit our little genre of defunctness and what used to be and all that kind of stuff in the realm of professional sports. And our guest this week, as you can kind of get a sense from that clip, is Cam Perron. And Cam is a fascinating guy, only now in his early 20s, but has lived, if you will, arguably a lifetime of professional sports fandom, and in a unique, some would say unusual, and certainly unexpected kind of way. The book that Cam has written just came out last week. It's called Comeback Season, My Unlikely Story of Friendship with the Greatest Living Negro League Baseball Players. It is written in partnership with Nick Childs and forwarded by the late, unfortunately, great Hank Aaron. And it is the story, as you can get a sense, of a most unusual relationship with a young teenager, now young adult male who grew up as a baseball fan, just out and out general baseball fan, and just fell in love with this thing called the Negro Leagues, which was relatively new to a young Cam back in, when was it? 2007 or so, at the age of 12, when this interest / intrigue / borderline obsession, I guess, began. And this was Cam's ultimate devotion, if you will, that became to this mystical, mysterious, quizzical thing known as the Negro Leagues. And again, for older types like myself, we've been through various epochs, if you will, and introductions and reintroductions to what now is sort of commonly known as the Negro Leagues, right? The baseball series by Ken Burns back in the 90s, reintroducing it sort of on a grand scale, et cetera. And we may be taking for granted that this Negro League thing, and arguably plenty more things yet to come from that, right? Major League Baseball finally putting the Negro Leagues on equal footing in terms of statistics and its embrace and all that kind of stuff. All overdue, right? But put yourself in the chair, in the seat, in the mindset of a 12-year-old kid growing up in the Boston area as a Red Sox fan, and just kind of being a baseball fan, right? We've explored this many, many, many times. There's sort of those impressionable years, especially if you're a young male of that age, right? Who has sports either by playing or fandom and stuff. That's when some of this original and lasting bonds actually get formed. Hell, it's sort of the excuse for our little show, as we've talked about ad nauseum. But I digress. 2007, Cam Perron was 12 years old and just a baseball fan, and he just somehow discovers and becomes intrigued with this Negro Leagues thing. And God bless, I guess, in this case, the internet, because it certainly becomes sort of this treasure trove of exploration. And as you'll hear in this conversation, and as hinted into the clip earlier, I'll describe that in a second, we get into a great conversation with Cam and this book, which you should run, not walk to get. It's a fascinating tale of a young teenage kid who just reaches out and finds out more about, literally by person, of some of these, frankly, neglected, forgotten players that played in the Negro League. And not only did Cam sort of, start to correspond with these guys and frankly befriend them, but now in his quote unquote later years, if you can call 24 or 25 years old later years, I think 24 maybe, if I do my math correctly, has actually been instrumental in helping a lot of these former great players get some of their, if you will, just desserts. Things like financial support and restitution, I guess, and pension stuff, and just shining more of a spotlight, maybe more directly in their directions, and perhaps helping some of these players get further recognition in terms of statistics, or just overall attention to their stories that either their families or their neighbors didn't sort of fully believe or understand. But this unlikely story, this sort of a platonic love affair, if you will, between just an all-American, red-blooded American baseball fan and this curiosity known as the Negro Leagues, at least to him, and shining a light more on this the stories and the discoveries. I mean, you have to really listen to this conversation greatly. That clip was from, I think it was 2017. So what, about almost 4 years ago? And Cam has been a guest a couple of times on Real Sports with Brian Gumbel on HBO, from where that clip came. There is a wonderful TED Talk. It's only 5 or 6 minutes long, and it is well worth your time to find it on YouTube and perhaps some other places too. But on YouTube, go find it. Cam basically talks about his entire story in about 6 minutes. Luckily, we've got about an hour and change to kind of get more layered in it. But suffice to say, this is a wonderful and completely unexpected conversation with a still young guy who is just has done so much for numerous dozens and dozens of players in the old Negro Leagues, and still has plenty of stuff yet to contribute and bring to their lives. And to a person, these Negro League players are just absolutely ecstatic to have been rediscovered, found, and then some, either financially or laudatorily, or both. And we'll get into some of the dynamics of how this scenario sort of came about, what piqued Cam's interest in this somewhat, shall we say, mystical Negro Leagues thing, why it's become a passion and or an obsession, and this sort of bond, this ongoing and strengthening bond between this legion of strangers, frankly, that Cam stumbled into, if you will, and has become, frankly, the biggest champion of. And again, this book is called Comeback Season. Get yourself a copy, toot sweet. It's by Gallery. It's published by Gallery Books. And of course, there'll be a link to it on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 220. You'll click that link. It takes you to Amazon. We'll get a couple of referral shekels of love. But buy it directly or indirectly, wherever you get books. Just don't wait to get it, because it's great. And hopefully this conversation gives you just a sheer scratching of surface of this wonderful story. Our conversation with Cam Perron, we're talking about the Negro Leagues and his unlikely but fantastically interesting story about how he came to more personally be part of this still ongoing story of the great, the wonderful, and ongoingly rediscovered Negro Leagues. Coming up in just a few moments' time. Stick around. This is a fascinating conversation, and it's great. It's just great. One quick promotional thing. Let's get that out of the way, shall we? We don't want to get out of the way. We just want to spend a couple of minutes of thanks for our friends at 503 Sports. Yeah, 503-sports.com. It's our pal Dustin Alameda in beautiful Portland, Oregon. The website is 503-sports.com. They call themselves, he does, and they do, the king of throwbacks. 503-sports.com. Promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Great stuff. It's not only shirts, but as you know, lovingly handcrafted and accurate garb of all sorts, jerseys and sweaters, if you will, from leagues and teams, not pennants, but that's other places for that. We'll talk about those in other episodes, but caps, T-shirts, yes, but those jerseys are just exquisite, one-of-a-kind items. You get your names on the back of them. And yes, a tremendous collection of Negro League stuff in those realms. Again, the jerseys, the flannels, they're just terrific. And not just of the Negro Major Leagues, but also a whole bunch of Negro Minor League stuff. But that's not just all the stuff you're going to find. You're going to find all kinds of other collections there. From the world of football, arena football, and the USFL, the WFL, the XFL, the UFL, our pal Michael Hugh, reminiscing on all that stuff. Lots of baseball stuff, some ABA basketball jerseys that are now in the collection of 503-sports.com, promo code SEATS, and hockey too, the WHL, the WHA, the IHL, and all kinds of great stuff too, some remixes and all that kind of stuff. All of that, and as they say, more at 503-sports.com. And the promo code again for 10% off all of your purchases is SEATS. Thank you to Dustin for his continued support of the show. One of our longer lasting and original sponsors. And we can't thank him enough for his continued sponsorship of the show. And we can't thank you enough for not only trying him out and using that discount code and hopefully purchasing a couple of things, but also for continuing to listen, as you do, hopefully each week, to our interview in this week's episode. Again, here's our conversation that we had with Cam Perron. It's terrific, and I am excited to finally bring it to you. Have a seat, pop open a cool one, and sit back. And as always, please enjoy. I'm sure I'm not the first person to say this is beyond an incredible story. It defies logic, right? Because on so many different fronts. So let me ask you, I guess, just to sort of set up, how does something like this get started? I mean, you're in middle school, and this becomes an interest, and it quickly becomes a fascination, and almost exhaustively so. No?
Yeah, definitely. It got started long before middle school, I would say, with a variety of other interests that finally kind of brought me here. The first just being my youthful obsession for collecting whatever was on my mind that week. Throughout elementary school, I collected stamps, coins, comic books, action figures. Nirvana import CDs, rare, kind of like bootleg stuff. It was an early fascination of mine. And I would go to antique stores and just kind of pick up little things at yard sales, and whatever I was interested in that given moment, I would collect. So we had a couple local comic book stores in town. We had a coin shop one town over. My grandfather collected coins. So I just kind of had this interest in exploring history, collecting things for the history. When you pick up an old coin, you just kind of think about, well, why were coins pre-1964 made of silver? It was a different time. They did things differently. It wasn't always about the item itself. It was about the history. So towards the end of elementary school, having always played sports, been a sports fan, I pretty much played every sport there was to play. But baseball was my favorite. And when the Red Sox won the World Series in 2004, it kind of propelled my interest in baseball much further.
Interesting. So this is in the suburbs of Boston, right? So hence the Red Sox affiliation and affinity, yeah?
Yeah, a couple times over.
But so when do these two interests / passions cross, right? The collecting and the baseball, right? I don't hear in your collection obsessions and or weekly intrigues, things like baseball cards or stubs or, programs or any of that kind of stuff, or maybe that was part of it, or what?
Not really. Back then, as a kid, you would go into a Walgreens or convenience store, and you can't really do it now, but back then you could pick up a pack of cards for $1 or $2. And, so I would just buy a pack of cards here and there. I had hockey cards, baseball cards, football cards. I would just get them here and there. I had a little bit of a collection, but nothing much. And once the Red Sox won the World Series, having watched the entire season, Red Sox hadn't won a World Series since Babe Ruth left the team, and it really just kind of captivated myself and opened all of New England really just was all about the Red Sox. It was just the biggest thing that could have happened. And the Boston Globe, they started putting out these little souvenir card sets in the newspaper. I believe Dunkin' Donuts had a little kind of thing where you go in and you buy some donuts and they give you like a little Red Sox knick-knack. There was this pin set where you could collect all the different players. So I started this little kind of ragtag collection of Red Sox related stuff pertaining to the World Series. And then shortly thereafter, I started meeting some of the players on the team, and each guy, just having watched the entire season, I really just remembered each little player and what they did to contribute to the Red Sox getting to the World Series and winning. So Johnny Damon, he had a book signing. I found out about it in the newspaper. We went out to that book signing with my mom and my brothers and a couple friends, and we waited in line for 4.5 hours in the snow. We get into the book signing, and we'd waited a couple hours, and the people that work at the Borders book start telling us that he's not going to be able to get to us. He's got to go. So we start chanting, "Johnny, don't go. Johnny, don't go." The whole store started chanting, and he ended up staying all night and meeting everybody and signing. And I got up there and I got to try on the World Series ring and get a picture with him. And a couple weeks later, I met David Ortiz at a local arcade. By the time we got in line, waiting, 4 hours plus again, by the time we got up there, they told us we could only get a picture with him if we took it with a group of like 20 other people that were around us in line, which was just kind of a letdown. So I started to get this little bit of like bitter taste in my mouth about just meeting these current players. While, the interactions were nice to a point, you'd wait for hours. It didn't always go too well. At the David Ortiz thing, he wouldn't sign like the card and ball that I had brought. So I started to just get more interested in some of like the older types of collectibles. Around the same time, I started when I was scouring the newspaper for different appearances with the Red Sox players. I saw that there was a monthly auction that took place in my hometown, a memorabilia auction, as well as a couple local card shops and card shows that would advertise. So I started kind of going out to some of those places. and just
So
learning.
that's the entree then, huh? That's the sort of the gateway drug, so to speak, for that's where the sports memorabilia thing starts to hit.
Yes, definitely.
So explain to me that sort of transition, because it seems like it's almost like you meticulously avoided it, and now all of a sudden you're sort of maybe inundated or overwhelmed, or you see all the the cards and I'm guessing the stories that come with them is maybe just as equally or maybe even more fascinating.
Yeah, when your sole focus was meeting the players, you kind of miss so much more of what the whole collectible and baseball world had to offer. And I think that I personally got a lot more out of learning about the history and seeing the old memorabilia and talking with fellow collectors and really just learning the hobby. And that's what really got me interested. So I would go to this local baseball card shop, and everyone else would come into the shop, and they would open packs of current Topps baseball, and you would pull like a new rookie card and it would be worth $50, 1 week. And then by the end of the season, it'd be worth 10 and nobody cared about the guy anymore. And you'd go into these auction houses. There was this local auction called Hall's Nostalgia in my hometown. One of the oldest memorabilia auctions in the country. They're since shut down, but they had got started way back. And it was only about a mile away from my house. So I would go in there on Friday nights, and everyone around me was 50 plus. I was 11, 12, and they would just auction off 300-400 lots of stuff, and I would sit around and just kind of absorb information, and people would tell me about all these old baseball cards and programs, and I just started kind of learning about collectibles and just bidding on a couple little things. A lot of times people would, I would bid on something, and then all the guys would say, like, let them have it, I'm not going to outbid them, and then the memorabilia.
At what point does your family start to worry about you hanging out with guys 40 years older than you?
I would say at the baseball card shows. So at the baseball card shows, they would have them every 3 to 4 weeks at various kind of hotels in the surrounding towns outside Boston. And there was this one show in Burlington, Massachusetts. And I would get there. It'd be on Saturday, I believe. I'd get there at like 7 in the morning. The show would open at 8. So I'd be one of the first ones there. And there's all these men, again, 30, 40, 50 years older than me, with all their little booths and stuff. And I would just walk around the show and talk with these guys. And a lot of them, a lot of the dealers at the show at that time were not too into like modern stuff. You kind of have two sides to the hobby. You have the current stuff, the current rookies, who's hot right now, and then you have the vintage. And everyone at the show seemed to be into the vintage. And kids would come in and talk about on occasion and talk about the newer cards, and the dealers didn't really care for that. So I would just learn all about these different, old variations of cards, 1952 Topps, 1952 Topps errors, like who to look out for. Everyone kind of, there was a common consensus that, vintage pre-1970 was what you wanted to collect. That was the stuff that, was rare. Mint condition cards from back then were the cards that, they weren't really kept in pristine condition back then. Kids would get the packs. They wouldn't put them immediately into top loaders and store them in pristine condition. So to find an old card in good shape, that was a big deal. So I just started to, I would go through bins and bins and try to find essentially the cheapest card in good condition. That was the oldest. And just started to put together some of this stuff and just kind of learned week after week.
And how does that then drag you or get you into the Negro Leagues, which I would suggest probably have a dearth or very little or not even any things in the way of that kind of memorabilia?
Yeah, so that was another thing altogether. So I would go to the show every couple weeks when they had it, and I eventually the guy that ran the show said, "Cam, do you want to help me out?" So I ended up going into the autograph room with him. He would have a show with about 40 to 50 dealers, and then he would have a guest, and the guest would be like a retired athlete, baseball player, hockey player, someone like Louis Tion, for example, Red Sox player in the 70s. People like that. So I started kind of collecting autographs of some of those guys at the show. And then meanwhile, a friend of mine at school, I was over his house one day, and he told me about how, he had collected cards, and him and his dad would write letters to former baseball players. You would go on this website called sportscollectors.net. You can make a free membership, and you could see the addresses of former players. You would send them a letter, a self-addressed stamped envelope, and a couple baseball cards, and you would see who would reply and who wouldn't. Again, none of the modern players would reply. All the older players would reply. So I started writing to the older players. And I did that for about 6 months, juggling. So then I started going to the baseball card show. I would look through the bins and try to find cards from the 50s, 60s, and 70s of guys who would sign through the mail. Then I would write letters to them, send out the cards I had bought, and get them back. Did it like crazy. Within a matter of months, got hundreds of requests. I would probably send 40 or 50 letters out a week.
And these guys didn't seem like or think that, now this is what, like 10, 15 years ago, right? So is this, do they sort of perceive that do they enjoy the correspondence factor of it, or do they realize that their signatures are likely to be sort of part of somebody's enterprise, so to speak?
It was kind of, back then, it wasn't, I wouldn't say it was blown out as much as it is now. I think a lot more people kind of have the eBay mentality in their head now. But one thing I did notice was a lot of these players were just kind of going through the motions. There wasn't really any correspondence. It was just you write them a letter, they sign your cards, they send them back. They wouldn't send you a letter back. And I started to notice that the guys that would send you a letter back were these guys who played like one game with the Detroit Tigers in like 1942. A guy who didn't get as many letters as Duke Snider or Sparky Anderson or Bobby Dorr. Those guys would just get the cards, sign them, send them back. There was no correspondence. It was really just like, okay, like we're old school. We'll sign your stuff. We're not, commenting on if you're selling it or not. Like, I guess you're a collector. So I was like, everyone, like you could go on the website and see who would reply, how many people sent to them, and what percentage of them got them back. You would go and look at Duke Snider, and 500-600 people would have sent to him in the last couple of years. And you're like, well, you know what? Like, I'm not really getting much from this. Yeah, I'm getting the autograph, but that's not that cool. When I write to a guy who played one game, a cup of coffee player, they would send these cool letters back. So I started focusing on that more, writing to these more obscure players and having a little bit more of a correspondence with them. And then right around that same time, Topps came out with a baseball card set called Allen and Ginter in 2007. And the Allen and Ginter set, they would feature like about a dozen or 24 players from, previous eras. They would throw in a couple different celebrities. It was kind of a unique take on a card set. And in that set, they included about 5 or 6 Negro League players. So I wrote to them. I said, this is cool. I don't think anyone has written to these players before. And a couple weeks later, I get these 2, 3, 4-page handwritten letters back. So I was like, whoa, I've never got anything like this before.
What did you know of the Negro Leagues then? Just aside from the fact that they were showing up as these, maybe to you, obscure, dusty roads from baseball's past. Did you have any knowledge or historical perspective, or was it just sort of another sort of branch of baseball player that you were writing to for the first time?
I knew a bit about the Negro League, not too much. I was 12 at that time. It was 2007, I want to say. And I had been collecting, kind of increasing my knowledge in baseball history since about 2004. So I knew about the Negro League. I knew Jackie Robinson had got a start there. I had heard of Satchel Paige. The friend of mine that introduced me to writing letters through the mail, he had gotten Buck O'Neill back before he had passed away. So I knew a bit, but I didn't know that much. And when these players would write back to me, it really started to spur my interest and, push me to want to learn more.
All right. So learning more is one thing, but going, 2 or 3 steps arguably further. Fast forward a little bit to, as you're getting older and these correspondences are going well, this is, Could I call it an obsession? Could I? What would you call sort of, or is it sort of a, I don't know, a curiosity rabbit hole, maybe even history oriented kind of pursuit?
I would definitely call it a pursuit. Definitely an obsessed pursuit. When I kind of look at it as a whole, I call it just a passion project. But that kind of sums up like the later part, because at that time it was really just a pursuit, an obsessive pursuit.
And what are you learning in these correspondences? I mean, so what are they writing to you about? They're obviously, to coin a very old term, tickled pink to hear from you. And as you sort of alluded to, right, so there's the obscure players or those that have been long forgotten or never remembered in the first place, right, that probably are just bent over backwards to exchange greetings and correspondence with somebody who just took the time to actually find them and remember them.
Yeah, so the big thing was at first, it was not that correspondence. It was the hunt and the chase, I guess, finding these players. Because what happened was after I had written to the players in this top set, it was the next question was like, are there any other players I can write to? And there were a couple dozen players that a couple collectors and I had found addresses for. There was also this sports address book, and it featured some players, most of whom there would be an address listed and the guy would have already passed away or could no longer sign. So I kind of hit this roadblock after a couple months where I had written to the couple dozen players whose addresses I had. And then I started, I was like, I need to find some more players to write to. There's got to be more players left. And that took me to this Negro League baseball forum, which was just like kind of an old school Reddit-esque kind of forum. And people would post. So I started making posts like, does anybody have any other addresses of players I can write to? So I started trying. My goal was to find more players to write to. And this forum allowed me to make some posts, get connected with another couple of researchers who would give me addresses. And then there were a couple of ball players on that forum as well. And we began kind of exchanging correspondence over email and over the phone. And the big kind of common denominator was with the players who I did get in touch with was none of them had stayed in touch with their former teammates at all, but they had, some of them had to be alive. If you had looked at the 1955 Kansas City A's, the 1955 Yankees or something like that, at that time, over half the team was still alive. Why would there only be like one person on the 1955 Kansas City Monarchs who, you could get a hold of? So players would give me information like, hey, I'm 81. My teammate was 2 years older than me. He was from Florida. And I started looking on white pages and some of these online phone directories to see if I could find somebody who's matched that background. And then I just started calling phone numbers and seeing if it was them.
So this is in high school for you, right now?
Oh, this is middle school.
Middle school still. Okay.
Seventh grade, yeah.
What you're describing are journalistic skills, frankly, that I think many even older generationally writers and practitioners of journalism would envy. So it sounds like sort of there's this linear connection thing where you're finding people and corresponding with them and sort of getting connected, but then you're also realizing there's a horizontal connectivity that's missing. It's almost sort of like a networking effect. And I'm assuming, of course, most of these players, if any, or have anything close to internet literacy at that point, right? So it's almost an opportunity then to web some of these guys back together and maybe generate some more interesting stories and stuff.
Exactly. And that's what really pushed me. So it kind of, one of my biggest, the first example of that really got me was a man named Al Barks. He was a former player who had somehow figured out how to post on this Negro League forum, one of the few players who did so. He had posted, hey, I played with the New York Black Yankees in 1956. Like, does anyone have any information on my career? We began talking, and he told me about some of his former teammates and whatnot. And then I got in touch with another player named Reginald Howard, and he ended up sending me a couple like old program copies that he had been featured in. And I saw on that roster, Al Barks. So I said, oh, well, Reggie, like I've I've corresponded with this Al Barks guy that, played with you back in 1956. And neither of them had communicated. So then I got the two of them together. And then while talking with Reggie, he had told me about another teammate of his named Gilbert Black, who had played with him on the Clowns. And so my next step was, well, maybe I can find Gilbert Black and start to kind of find the rest of the guys on this team. So while scouring through this forum, I saw an old post from a woman who said my father played in the Negro League. And I messaged her and said, what's your father's name? I didn't hear back for a while. In the meantime, I'm calling all these phone numbers. I was told Gilbert Black lives somewhere in New York or Connecticut. Called all these numbers. One person told me he had passed away. I hit a bunch of wrong numbers and old numbers. Couldn't find the guy. Finally, a couple months later, the daughter, gets back to me and says, my father's name is Gilbert Black. And I'm like, whoa, like the Gilbert Black from Connecticut or New York? She says, yes. So she gets me in touch with her father. And then I get in touch with Gil. I put him in touch with his, these other two guys. And the chain kind of continues. So I was like slowly kind of assembling or reconnecting this old team that had parted ways back in the mid 50s.
Okay. Before we go further, I have to ask the question, why? What's driving you to do this?
Well, at first it was really autographs. I was really pushed to just collect autographs from these kind of forgotten legends and players who hadn't really been reached out to before. Like I was talking about a little while ago about hundreds of people having written to Duke Snider and Bobby Doerr. That wasn't cool. If anyone could do it, it wasn't, exciting. It could be done. So being able to find guys that I could get signatures of when I knew nobody had, known about them before, interviewed them before, it was pretty cool. And then after speaking to the players on the phone and realizing that none of them had stayed in touch with their former teammates, and in this kind of early time, I was already able to get a couple guys in touch with each other. I figured, this can be done on a much larger scale. There's got to be hundreds of players out here who can get in touch with their former teammates who must still be alive. Some of them must still be alive. And then the third note, none of these players ever had seen any old newspaper articles or really had much tying them to their career. And in talking with the players, I realized, well, if you played a game in North Carolina on a Sunday night, by Monday morning, you could be in Virginia on to play the next team, and you never saw the newspaper from that game the night before. And what if you had, an amazing game and got featured in the newspaper? They never saw that stuff. And while I was going on White Pages and some of these People Finder websites, I started going on newspaper archive websites, and I was able to pull up some old newspaper articles, and I started finding these old articles that featured a lot of these guys, and they had never seen them before. So I was like, combining the lack of really any newspaper articles or documents tying them to their career, not staying in touch with any of their former teammates, and not really being recognized in any sort of way, I was like, I felt like we were on a bit of a race against time, and if these players were out there, and I knew that I could kind of do this, well, I felt like I had to do it.
Yeah, almost like an obligation. It almost feels to me like you're starting to tip towards, this is less about me and my own personal desires and curiosities, and frankly, maybe more about them.
Yeah. And at that time, it wasn't the autograph importance started to, that wasn't the sole focus anymore.
So what are you learning about these players in this process? I have been under the illusion that, there a renaissance of knowledge, curiosity, understanding of the Negro Leagues really sort of got kickstarted into higher gear with the baseball documentary series of Ken Burns, right in the 90s. This was the first sort of truly sort of publicly accessible documentary treatment, if you will. Yeah, there've been some great books and stuff, and but you kind of had to be a bit of a baseball historian or maybe even a nerd in sports history and that kind of stuff to kind of really know. This was sort of like the first sort of, I guess, mainstreaming, I guess, of this long languishing history and gigantic chapter in baseball. But you're describing really still a group of players who, and again, this is sort of some semi-early internet, right? So, we have to sort of put this in perspective. Still not really connected, not really sort of, celebrated and or, I guess revered yet. And you're I find it really curious that it's a solo discovery, that like some of this stuff, some of these connections, some of these relationships hadn't sort of really been done before.
Yeah, back to the Ken Burns, I definitely agree. That was one of the first major showcases of several hours of in-depth kind of footage on the Negro League. I think that was kind of the beginning of a lot of people not really knowing much about the Negro League, starting to take a little bit of an interest in it. A lot of the guys that were kind of doing interviews in that documentary and known to be alive then, some of them did a couple autograph signings and they had a couple little reunions throughout the 90s and stuff. But, I started to kind of see that there were a lot more guys out there. The baseball documentary really just touched on a small percentage of the guys that were really out there, because no one really knew, how much was out there. And yeah, back in 2007, the internet was kind of young. Most of these players still operated mostly through the phone, home phones, wasn't really cell phones. That was, when I called people, I was calling them on my home phone, my family's home phone, and calling their home phone. The newspaper archive.
It's almost quaint when you sort of juxtapose it against social media and phones today.
Yeah, you could actually get a hold of people a lot easier back then, I noticed, because if you've had the same home phone number for 25 years, which most people did at the time, it was a lot easier to find. Nowadays, a lot of people have scrapped their home phones and they have a cell phone, and those phone numbers don't pop up on on white pages as easily. So I was able to get a hold of people a little bit better, and a lot of these older players, they would just be at home. They were retired, would answer the phone. So I think being able to get enough of, people that answered their phones, versus if 99 phone calls resulted in one answer, I probably would have been a little bit frustrated. And while I did have that at times, I think the success rate was pretty good and a lot, pushed me to keep going.
Can you kind of categorize some of the substance of these conversations and these correspondences? Is it happy memories? Is it wistful? Is it are they clearly specific in their memories? Is it cloudy and hazy with age? What any themes that sort of evolve in these oral and written learnings that you're finding?
Yeah, so and I'd call these guys up. The phone calls were not short in most cases. A lot of times I'd call a guy up for the first time and we'd be on the phone for 2-3 hours. Really just kind of started with me introducing myself and my little conquest of trying to interview former players. And within a matter of minutes, most players would open up and we'd start talking as if they were there on the ball field back in the day. We would talk about in most of our first phone calls, I would just ask players about who they had played for and their former teammates, and they would quickly jump into various memories of different ball games. And while there was a lot of the negatives as well, a lot of the racism that players faced, getting chased out of town by the KKK, not being able to stay in hotels, so you would just stay on the bus. A lot of players would tell the same story about kind of sending in the lightest skinned player on the team into a diner to get food for everybody because maybe they could pass for white and they could get food. If not, they'd have to go, to the next town and see if they could pull it off there. So you'd hear stories like that. And There was a lot of bus breakdown stories. Towards the 50s, the Negro League was dwindling, and finances weren't like they were pre-integration. So the team owners, they wouldn't repair a bus, and sometimes you just have a bus breakdown in the middle of nowhere, and they'd be stuck. And so I'd hear all sorts of those stories. And after, I'd speak to a player a couple times, they would start to ask me about myself, and we would start talking about, how I played baseball, and they would give me advice. They'd tell me about their family and what they did after baseball. Most players kind of, started like most young kids, loved baseball, wanted to go pro, grew up in a small town. Most former Negro League players lived and grew up in the South. There were more teams down south. The Negro League didn't really touch on the Northeast as much, or the West, while there were some teams, but not as much. Most players just, they play a couple seasons. Guys towards the 50s and early 60s, many would get signed and it didn't work out, or they got injured, and then that was that. They went on, they got another job, and they'd tell friends and family about their days. But I think when I reached out to them and wanted to hear all these stories and just pick their brain, I think it kind of opened them up a little bit more.
All right, what's this? Blue Chew! All right, Blue Chew is making waves and bringing more confidence to the bedroom, guys. Hey, Blue Chew is a unique online service that delivers the same active ingredients as Viagra and Cialis, but in chewable form and at a fraction of the cost. Blue Chew's tablets combat, he says, all forms of ED and can help men gain extra confidence for when it's time to perform. Blue Chew is an online prescription service, so no visits to the doctor's office, no awkward conversations, and no waiting in line at the pharmacy. And it ships right to your door in a discreet package. The process is simple. Sign up at bluechew.com, consult with one of their licensed medical providers, and once you're approved, you'll receive your prescription within days. The best part? It's all done online. Blue Chew's licensed medical providers work with you to find the right ingredient and strength for your prescription. Don't like swallowing pills? No problems here. Blue Chew's sildenafil and tadalafil, you say that 3 times fast, tablets are chewable. Yes, Blue Chew's tablets are made in the USA, and they prepare and ship direct, so it's cheaper than a pharmacy. So, if you could benefit from some extra confidence when it's time to perform, visit bluechew.com for more details and important safety information. And of course, we've got a special deal for our great listeners. Try Blue Chew free. Yeah, free when you use the promo code GOODSEATS at checkout. Just pay $5 shipping. That's Blue Chew. That's BLUECHEW. BlueChew.com. Promo code GOODSEATS to receive your first month free. And of course, we thank Blue Chew for sponsoring this little episode here. And now back to our conversation. How does this evolve into the reunion in Birmingham in later years? And I'm guessing you're getting into high school now at this point, and what are it's becoming now. I mean, you're getting finally a chance to actually meet some of these guys, and what comes of that? Besides just pictures and a reunion, I sense that, and having read a whole bunch of your book, there's some other issues there that almost seem like they just sort of jump out and need even deeper treatment than what you're doing thus far.
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, by my freshman year in high school, it's now about 2009. My daily life pretty much consists of getting all my schoolwork done in school. I'll do homework for one class in another class, come home and instantly just start calling players, going on newspaper websites and trying to find old articles, which I would kind of use to pinpoint how old a player might be when I'm trying to track somebody down. And then I'd call players up. If I found a new guy, I would interview him and then get him in touch with some of his other teammates. So I'm starting to like assemble these little circles of former teammates reconnecting. Between 2008 and 2009, so my 8th grade to freshman year in high school, I'd probably found 40 to 50 players who I would say previously had not been interviewed about their days in the Negro League. So I'm starting to gather this huge rotation of guys who I would call all the time. We would maintain friendships. I started to get pretty close with a lot of these guys. And at the same time, I got in touch with this researcher named Dr. Leighton Ravel in Texas. And at the time, I'm 13. Dr. Ravel's in his late 50s. And I'd kept seeing his name come up online in various articles. And so I called him up. He thought I was doing a school project. And I just kind of had to tell him, well, actually, it's much more than that. And when we started talking, we quickly clicked. And over the coming months, Dr. Ravel and I got really close. We would talk on the phone multiple times a day. I would just call him every time I found any new piece of information, which at that time was every couple hours. And we started to realize towards the end of 2009 that there were a lot more players known to be alive than we realized. Back when he started getting into this, back in the 80s and 90s, he was told there's only a couple hundred players alive. No one really kept like a real database on how many players were living. You couldn't just go on Wikipedia and type in a player's name and see their birth date or when they had passed away. There was really nothing like that. You could play 5 seasons in the Negro League, played in 5 All-Star games, and nothing would come up.
No, you might see the stats now on seam heads, but it still doesn't tell you about like where they live or if they're still alive, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. So Dr. Ravel and I were like, well, you know what? There's a lot of guys out here. And he said, I think we should do something. We have this little organization down in Birmingham, Alabama. He had a good friend by the name of Chef Clayton Sherrard, who was a former bat boy with the Black Barons back in the 1950s in Birmingham. And there were a couple of these like little player organizations that were just made up of living players who would get together and they would go out to a baseball game and sign autographs or speak at schools. So there was just a little kind of community in Birmingham. He said, I think we've had this banquet every year for some of these players down in Birmingham. Maybe we can do a little bit more in the next year. Cam, you've found a bunch of these guys who you've, become quite close with. And I have a bunch of guys that I know. Let's see if we can do some sort of week-long reunion of some kind. So I said, okay, I'm in. So him and Chef, they started kind of getting the pieces of the puzzle together. Meanwhile, I was 13 turning 14. I knew nothing about event planning or anything. I just figured, okay, like we have an event in the works. I'm just going to call up all these baseball players and tell them to come to Birmingham, on Memorial Day when we have this event. So no invites, nothing, literally just phone calls. So I called dozens and dozens of players. And at that time, you had some players who were in their late 60s who had played with the Kansas City Monarchs in 1962 or 1963 during the final season of the Negro League. And then you had guys that were 90 years old who had played in the 30s. So I would call everyone up, and some couldn't make it. Some players, had daily dialysis or, other severe ailments. And but many said, "Yeah, I'll come." Oh, you told me my teammate's going to be there, and the players would have phone calls on their own with each other. And they said, "Oh, are you going to go to this event?" They say, "Yeah," and the other guy would say, "Yeah, you know what? I'll be there too." So I just kept inviting as many players as I could. And finally, I would say about a month before the event in May 2010, Dr. Ravel sent out invites to all the guys that I invited. I had about 30 or so players who told me they'd go. And Dr. Ravel and Chef, they figured, what's the chance these guys will actually show up on, Cam's word? And many of whom lived 10, 12, 15 hours away. So we had the event. I ended up taking a week off of school my sophomore year of high school, and we went down there. I went down there with my mom, and all the guys that told me they'd go went. And we had this big event. week long of activities. We stayed in downtown Birmingham, Alabama, and we had about 60 or 70 players, I would say, that showed up.
Who's more astonished? You that all these guys showed up, or them, this, punk white kid, from the Boston suburbs is still not even halfway through high school, is even remotely interested in their history and plights?
I would say it was probably 50-50. I mean, to me, I was very, I didn't know what I was doing. I just figured if I invited players, they would come. If you build it, they will come. Field of Dreams reference. And then I think the players were just jaw dropped at the fact that, they came down to this reunion. And I was too, in the sense that Dr. Ravel and Chef Clayton had rented out this entire hotel in Birmingham, and they were able to throw together a big reception and a banquet, and we had a big game at Rickwood Field in Birmingham, which is I believe America's oldest. America's oldest operating ballpark. All the players went out on the field and got honored, and we had numerous guys who had played together back in the day that were able to see each other for the first time in 50 plus years. I remember I would say the coolest interaction was, I get to the hotel and Gilbert Black shows up, and he was one of the first guys that I had found several years prior. And I say, Gil, you got to meet Reggie Howard. It had now been probably about 2 years or so since I had connected them back around 2008. So they lock eyes, and they hadn't seen each other since 1956, and they just start chatting. And about an hour later, I come back up to Gil, and he's still standing outside the hotel holding his suitcase. He hadn't even put his suitcase down because he was just so locked into the moment, just seeing Reggie for the first time since 1956. It was crazy.
How does that make you feel? I mean, in many respects, you have no connection to these guys, yet you're actually, in many respects, responsible for reconnecting these guys. So I just find it fascinating. I mean, do you find yourself becoming a sort of a master of ceremonies and the ultimate sort of connector of that kind of stuff? It's almost like you're becoming a social director for these guys and their legacies.
Yeah, and that's kind of what it came to be, I would say. While I'm not a former baseball player, I'm just, this young kid from outside of Boston. I think, while the players were able to get connected with their former teammates and kind of bring baseball back into their lives and talk about their old days and reconnect and come out and sign autographs and do things that they hadn't done in decades, I kind of become this facilitator in all of it, which it kind of gave me my own unique part. And all these players really accepted me for that. They didn't have to. I was just intruding on their lives to get an autograph or call them up and pick their brain for whatever reason. But they took me in, and all these players have become really, great friends of mine. And yeah.
All right, let's round third base here and get into sort of the home stretch here. This takes a turn for towards more seriousness, right? Sort of as a result of this reunion and beyond. You go deeper even into trying to right some wrongs, right? That you've discovered and you're hearing. You want to talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, will do. So several years prior to the first reunion, I became close with a player by the name of Bob Mitchell, who had played with the Kansas City Monarchs in the early 50s. And Bob Mitchell was pretty much a one-man team trying to work with Major League Baseball to get former baseball players pensions, retirement benefits. Going back to the mid-'90s, Major League Baseball, and I believe Fay Vincent, the commissioner at the time, had teamed up with Joe Black, former Brooklyn Dodger and Negro League player, to start a pension program. And at the time, Joe Black was tasked with the role of trying to round up a bunch of players who could qualify for this pension. But he didn't know everyone that had played in the Negro League. He only played for several years in the mid-'40s before entering the majors. And this pension program never really got out there to as many people to as many players that qualified as it could. So Bob Mitchell, he would network with former players that he knew and players that other players knew, and he would try to get pensions for them. And I didn't know much about it, but he would always fill me in about it. So he started to get sick and not work on the pensions as much. He was able to get some guys them, but he didn't really have the documentation necessary. And what that was you needed 4 years of primary source documentation to prove that you had played in the Negro League. Major League Baseball needed newspaper articles, programs, dated photographs, contracts, anything that could really prove that you had played in the Negro League for those 4 years. So in most cases, you needed a newspaper article from 1950, 1951, 1952, and 1953, and that would be 4 years. So Dr. Ravel, he calls me up about a couple weeks before this first reunion and says, Cam, Major League Baseball got a letter from a guy named Paul Jones, who says he played with the Cleveland Buckeyes, among others, in the late 40s and early 50s. He was asking about a pension. And we had never heard of Paul Jones. We didn't know he was alive. Dr. Ravel says, Cam, can you look into this? I found 3 years on him. Can we find 4? So I start digging and looking through numerous articles, and after a couple weeks, I'm able to find this 4th year for Paul Jones. So while we're at the reunion, I give Dr. Ravel this newspaper article, and he says, "Okay, this looks good. Paul should be getting a pension." So on the final day that I'm at the reunion, Dr. Ravel announces publicly at this reception that Paul Jones is likely going to be getting a pension, and from there, it really just opened up the floodgates. Here we are at the Alabama Sports Hall of Fame in Birmingham, and we have about 50 to 60 former players present, and we make this public announcement that Paul Jones is going to be getting a pension, and now every other player in attendance says, "Whoa, do I qualify? Do I qualify?" So everyone's coming up to me asking me, and I didn't really know much about the thing at the time. So we close out the reunion, and I now have all these contacts of players and all these notes like, hey, you got to look into this guy's pension. Does this guy qualify? Does this guy qualify? So we leave the reunion. About a week or so later, it's confirmed Paul Jones is going to be getting a pension. He ends up getting over $100,000, which was just mind blowing. $10,000 a year plus back pay back to 2004 when the new version of the program was started. And now in addition to that, I have a kind of a case log of all these other possible guys that might qualify for pensions that we hadn't really thought about before. So that really was the next frontier to take on. Who qualifies? Can we get them a pension? Etc.
How do you find time then now? I mean, that's like a full-time nonprofit job, right? Doing that kind of stuff. How do you find time balancing your high school studies and arguably a full-time job, if you will, it's consuming at that, at the very least, to do this kind of stuff? Because this I got a sense. My sense is this requires quite a lot of investigation, a lot of time, a lot of dead ends. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, 3 p.m. to midnight plus weekends, I would say, is a full-time job. So, so yeah, I would say definitely a full-time job, which I was able to pull off after school and on weekends.
How many guys do you think you were directly or partially responsible for getting pensions from this program, do you think?
Over 40. It took a long time. Right after the Paul Jones pension, we were able to probably get about 5 or 6 other guys' pensions, people that we just didn't even realize they qualified. And after looking through newspaper articles, Ravel and I were able to get 4 years of proof and submit their forms, and they were approved. And then after a couple years, by 2011, 2012, it starts to get a lot harder. We've kind of gone through a lot of the guys. They've either qualified, they're kind of at a standstill. Let's say we have 2 or 3 verified years, but we need a 4th, and we just can't find it. And then some guys had passed away, or some guys didn't qualify. The worst were the guys that we thought qualified, or I thought qualified, and then they were declined. We had one guy that I had found, Randolph Bowe, and he was in his mid 90s, and I found 4 years, and then Major League Baseball turned it down. They said, one of the 4 years is a spring training game. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. You know how hard it is to find 4 years where they mention Randolph Bowe in the newspaper articles. And the problem is especially when you're a pitcher and you're not playing in every game, and many of the town's newspapers, and they wouldn't write about every player in a team or every player in a game. It's nothing like it was with the major leagues. Oftentimes they would just say, Kansas City Monarchs beat Indianapolis Clowns 4-2. So-and-so hit a home run, and that's all you would get. So Bowe got declined, and I had several others that got declined. And then, so it really started to slow down.
Well, they're also probably chasing, one-day appearances at these, non-league games, right? Because that was a huge part of the Negro League experience for a bunch of years, right? Where there was the barnstorming and all that other stuff, which was quote unquote unofficial, right? So, and God forbid they get injured in those quote unquote performances or non-league games, right? And that only, pushes them out from, maybe being mentioned in one particular newspaper during a league game, right? So it seems like a couple of literally and figuratively strikes against them in some respects.
Yeah. Major League Baseball was usually okay about saying if it was a non-league game, but you were confirmed to have been playing for the team in that year, then they're going to kind of give you a pass, like it's okay, because yes, at that time, you could play 100 games in a season and maybe only half of them would be league games or a third of them. They weren't too strict on that, but the spring training wasn't, during the season, so I understood that. But yeah, several strikes against them. And in many cases, like for example, one player who had come up to me that night after Paul Jones and his little ceremony in Birmingham, Eugene Scruggs, he had come up to me, and he's featured in the book, and he recounts a lot of his time in the Negro League and how I was finally able to get him a pension. But Eugene Scruggs, his last name is not super common, and the newspapers just always butchered his last name. They would call him Scraggs, Smith, Scruggs, spelled 5 different kinds of ways. So when you're going through articles, it was very difficult to say, oh, was that him? Did they spell his name wrong? Did they call him something else? And finally, after 6 years, I was finally able to find a 4th year for him. But he just kind of got unlucky because he had seen a lot of his former teammates get pensions, and we couldn't find the 4th year, and he was just on standby waiting.
Well, here's a silly question. What do they say once you presented them with the evidence and got them their pensions?
I think every player that has got a pension has been extremely grateful. When I look at it, it's something that I'm able to, being a younger individual who grew up on the internet and knows how to navigate this stuff, being able to do that when a lot of these players are, they don't even know where to begin. I think, they really appreciate my, ability to be able to do this and lock in a pension for them. In some cases, players have been able to pay for their grandkids' college tuitions, or buy a new house, or retire. Eugene, he was finally able to retire in his late 70s after getting a pension. So that was amazing. They're all just incredibly grateful.
Well, it's life-changing stuff. We've had some interesting conversations around the old ABA, American Basketball Association, which is still an ongoing thing, and there is. It's apparently very challenging, but there's a group of ABA players that are trying to make the strongest case that they can to be included into NBA pensions as well. And this is not this becomes a more and more common theme the more deep we go into these various leagues and histories and stuff, especially. And Negro Leagues is a little bit different, but especially when there was an absorption or a merger or those kinds of things where teams and players and franchises and all that kind of stuff were inherited or brought in or essentially subsumed into the bigger entity. There are a lot of loose ends there, right? And this is not only that, but it's also a story of frankly, just how big business sports has become literally in the last, 2 decades, right? It's just, it's a non-starter. I mean, beyond the pale, come the 40s and the 50s, right? This is life-changing stuff for guys who, many of which, we talk the Negro League stuff, they were just happy to be there. But, it's beyond all of that. And I can't imagine how eternally grateful they must have each to a person have been for those success stories and maybe even the appreciation for trying on their behalf, though not maybe succeeding in certain cases.
Yeah. I think the craziest story, too, is a player who turned down a pension.
Okay. Do tell.
So there was a player by the name of Alfred Cartmill who had played 4 seasons with the Kansas City Monarchs in the late 40s and early 50s, and he was the only person who ever turned one down that I encountered. But it just really showed me in the end that while a large percentage of players are grateful to have played in the Negro League or the minor leagues or both or what have you, at the end of the day, while they did have many struggles and they did encounter racism and hardship along the way, they still they're still eternally grateful for having the chance to play professional baseball. And Alfred Cartmill, I would say he just never got over it. And he just, at this point in his life, he just decided he did not want to be associated with baseball anymore. Those times were behind him. He never made the majors. He played in the minor leagues for a long time. He felt like Major League Baseball took away that chance from him, and he didn't want the pension.
That's powerful stuff. But it's telling, right? And the more we learn about the leagues and the players and the motivations and all that kind of stuff, right? I guess I don't want to over sort of generalize this, but in a lot of respects, it seems like a lot of this wasn't about the money. Although, right, also was part of maybe they did want to make the money and be professionals and were denied the chance, right? So there's sort of twin evils here and a whole bunch of other, things that sort of, who knows the psyche. I'm sure every individual has their own or had their own reasons for playing, their opportunities, the lack thereof, and frankly, just their the details and the information that they needed to kind of sort of be at least made somewhat whole in their later years. All right, let's just fast forward to now today. Why don't you tell our audience sort of what your life is now? Was there college in between? Did you sort of what's sort of happened with this story? I got to think some of the a lot of the players sadly are moving on in on this more from this mortal coil. What continues and lingers from all of this incredible stuff that you did as a younger gent?
Yeah, so we had the first reunion in 2010, and that the success of the first reunion resulted in it becoming a yearly tradition. So we've had a reunion every year since, with the exception of 2020 due to COVID. We've also had several other various events in Birmingham in between. In 2015, the Negro Southern League Baseball Museum was built in Birmingham. So we now have a new museum, which is filled with artifacts from primarily Dr. Ravel's collection and a little bit of mine, mostly just signed baseballs. So we now have just a huge museum dedicated to preserving this part of history, which is just amazing to see that get built. And many of the players living in Birmingham just go there and participate in events, and we have events at our reunion there. Over the years, we've had players have had baseball cards made. Going to the reunion has just connected them with other players and other possible events. So a lot of the guys who have come to the reunions have now, they go into schools and talk about their former playing days and stuff like that. So baseball has really kind of come back into their life a lot more in that regard. After high school, I went down to college in New Orleans. I went to Tulane University. That was fun.
Green
fun
wave. Let me guess.
Yeah.
History major?
Business.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't see that coming.
Yeah, business. So in the meantime, in order to support all this research stuff, I started flipping memorabilia on the side. I started going to these baseball card shows and auction houses, and I would buy stuff, and I started flipping it at these memorabilia shows on the spot. I'd buy something at one booth, sell it to another for double the price, or buy it there and then go home and sell it on eBay. So that business kind of took off, and I did that through my later years in high school and college, and that's now my full-time business. So after I graduated college, I got a job at WME, William Morris Endeavor, at a talent agency in Beverly Hills. So I said, you know what, screw it, let's give this a go. So I was an assistant at an agency for a year. I worked in the speaking engagements department, booking speaking engagements for a wide variety of celebrities, chefs, authors, political figures. And then after about a year there, I just decided it wasn't for me. And I decided to go back to my memorabilia stuff. And I've been doing that full time now since 2017.
What do you think you might have left in this Negro Leagues journey, if anything, besides the reunions? Are there any? Obviously, we see the Negro League Baseball Museum in Kansas City. I mean, there's just so much stuff that, and I see more and more tributes. We had Jerry Cohen from Ebbetsfield Flannels, who's a big, long-time devotee towards painstaking research and reproductions of what lots of different sports, but certainly Negro Leagues jerseys and uniforms and caps and stuff might have been. Do you ever sort of think that there are some, shall we say, equitable business opportunities to maybe further not only the history and the knowledge, but fill the coffers not only of these museums, but perhaps of the players still around and or their and their progeny in the years to come, to sort of keep the history and the spirit and frankly further investigation to these leagues and these players alive?
First of all, yeah, I think Ebbetsfield does a great job of making reproduction jerseys and hats that look just like they did back in the day. As for business opportunities, I really don't know. I've kind of always separated my business life from trying to look at ways to make money with the Negro League stuff. I'm sure in recent years we have lost a lot of players. Many of the players who used to attend the reunions have sadly now passed away. So the reunions have been getting smaller in recent years. I would say that as more and more players pass away, and with the recent attention and news that Major League Baseball has brought to the Negro League with their recognition of statistics,
long overdue, right?
Yeah, very long overdue. I would say with that, I think the players that are still here with us will probably, have a lot more interest put towards them. I'm sure once COVID subsides, a lot more teams and organizations, will be wanting to hear from these players.
Well, look, I wish you tremendous success with this book. I certainly hope that the COVID situation does we get some relief for that, so that you can maybe do some more in-person kinds of things. I can imagine. I can imagine the press junket that you're going to be on virtually. I can hear now an NPR interview. I just all kinds of stuff because it's a fascinating story. Just as a personal journey, number one. But number two, the intergenerationalness of it, the interracial part of the story, the passion, i.e., not a profit-driven thing or just childhood and early adulthood curiosity turned passion turned crusade, if you will, right? Righteous at that. There's a whole bunch of dimensions to this, and it's a great read. I wish you nothing but the best with it. But I do think, that as your last sort of sentences there, it does kind of worry certainly me, and I'm sure you too, a little bit, right? as these players get older, right, they're not making more of them, right? And it's almost like World War II veterans or others of generations that made their marks and or their dent in history. And once the last of them, leave us, it becomes even more challenging and, I would argue, doubly important to figure out ways to keep these stories, these legacies, and maybe further discoveries alive as we lose first-person participants from all that. So I would suggest, not so humbly, that this book, in particular, is a log on that fire that will continue to burn, hopefully, in the years to come once the original participants are fully no longer with us. But I can't imagine that this will be the last of your work in and around this space, even beyond this book.
Yeah, there's still more players alive than people realize. And while we are losing a lot of guys, there's still several hundred alive who played in the mid to late 50s and early 60s. And, I think as fewer and fewer remain, the players living, hopefully we can get more attention on documenting their career via interview and documenting their stories in film and whatnot. Something as like a lone wolf throughout this whole thing. I look back, and at my early days, a lot of players that I spoke with, all I really had is that conversation over the phone, and I didn't formally record their interview, and now they're passed away. So I hope in the future, with more resources and unfortunately fewer players, we can preserve some more of those interviews and give this the attention that it deserves.
All right. The book is called Comeback Season, subtitled My Unlikely Story of Friendship with the Greatest Living Negro League Baseball Players. It is written by Cam Perron, our guest this week, with the assistance of Nick Childs, and the foreword by the late, great Hank Aaron, of all people. Can you believe it? It is published by Gallery Books, an imprint of Simon & Schuster, so it's a big deal. It is available wherever books are found, of course. And yes, you, of course, can find it on our website or off of our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode with Cam Perron, and you'll find a convenient link that will take you right to Amazon. It'll give us a couple of shekels of goodness. We appreciate that. Thank you. You'll be able to get that book about as fast as humanly possible, whether that's in Kindle or hardcover or paperback version. I forget what versions it's available in, but get some for your friends. It's a tremendous read. The story is incredible, truly hard to believe, and it's great. And we look forward to staying in touch with Cam. I'm sure he's got more great stuff up his sleeve around this story and some of the great people and figures and personalities involved that sure just are just foundational around the Negro Leagues, and these are great stories, and I suspect that there are plenty more still yet to be discovered and unveiled and revealed, if you will, over the years to come. Cam can also be followed on Twitter at TheCam111, the THE Cam CAM 111, the Cam111 on Twitter. You can also go to his website. That's camperron.com, CAM as in Mary, PERRON, camperron.com. There's also a Facebook page, Cam Perron's Negro League page. Can you believe that? It's perfectly labeled. And Cam also has an e-commerce sports-related business out in LA. I'm sorry I don't have any of the particulars of that, but I'm sure if you searched up him on the interwebs there, you'll find connections into that as well. And like I said earlier, by all means, go out of your way to find his TED Talk from, gosh, I want to say it was 2009, 10, maybe 2011, 2000. I don't know when it was. It's only about 6 minutes long, but it literally just crystallizes his story which obviously goes into much more depth in the book, and that's worth watching too. And again, you'll scratch your head and go, wow, can this really be true? And luckily for all of us, it is. And we wish Cam the best of luck with this book, and hopefully we'll have another conversation or two down the road to hear about sort of those journeys too. I suspect some fun and frivolity to come from this book tour as well. Let's see. You want to keep following us and interact with us? We appreciate that. By all means, again, that website, goodseatsstillavailable.com, that's the locus for this show. You can find all of our social media feeds there. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. On Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. There's a Facebook page devoted to us as well. Follow us there if you'd like. Want to send us some email? We'll go right ahead. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Watch the spelling. Let's see. You can also sign up for our weekly email newsletter. There's a tab or a button somewhere on our website. You can opt into that. Why don't you? And our continued thanks, as always, to our pal Jerry Payne for his knob twiddling and equalizing this week. We appreciate your help, of course, as always. And we thank you, of course, for listening all the way through to this week's episode and all the other episodes. If you haven't listened to some of our other 200-plus shows, by golly, go right ahead and subscribe to us. Hey, please do us a favor. Would you rate and review us? That'd be great. Some 5-star ratings would certainly help. It helps the algorithm and stuff. Wherever you do that, whether it's an Apple or Google or Spotify or Pandora or Stitcher, whatever you do, wherever you do, just please do that and tell your friends. Why don't you too? That helps as well. We appreciate that. Thanks very much for listening. We'll see you next week. Hope it's warming up where you are and you're please staying safe. Until next week, take care, everybody. Bye.